Hi guys, sorry I didn't see my camera there. So I'm going to continue reading from Pete Walker's book, The Tao of Fully Feeling. And it's about childhood trauma. It's about a lot of people have anxiety and complex PTSD. Some people call it PTSD, or some people have anxiety and they don't understand that it is often complex PTSD related because anxiety comes from childhood trauma normally, and it's years and years of maybe abuse, even if it was subtle, the way we've been dealt with or spoken to as children or treated or not treated, and in decent ways. So as this happens over years and years, we begin to get to a point where we suffer and we're unable to basically be our true selves. So we have something called arrested development. And arrested development means that we don't know as we grow from being abused as children, we don't have compassion for ourselves, and we also don't have we don't know how to stand up for ourselves because we've had to hold back and not stand up to our parents as children. And because generally children will love their parents regardless of how the parents treat them, it's only when children get to an age and they realize that they have a choice and they've been abused that they are able to see what's going on. So if anybody joins and they want to if anybody joins and they want to speak, then or you want to leave a message, then you're able to do that. So I'm just going to make sure I'm running live from my mobile phone, and that I'm not just chatting to myself. So let's see. Put it on silent. So it's interesting. There's not there's not a lot of psychoeducation out there in reality, or people don't know where to go, and people don't realize they can have, people to talk to. There are lots of groups on Facebook that I know that are really good, anxiety, PTSD groups. And there's also a huge amount of books. And one of them that I found a couple of years ago was Pete Walker, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And then from that book, I bought his second book, and I'm going to show you. And it's here. It's called The Tao of Fully Feeling. And this book, I'm going to read some of this book because it's going to help people understand the dilemma that people have when they come from child abuse. So often the word child abuse, people think that it's really, the worst of the worst. But child abuse can be so subtle, and it can be very demeaning and really stop us from being who we truly are in the world. So when we deny the truth of our childhood to ourselves, then we don't get to grieve the losses that we had. And that means that we're half a person in the world. We're not whole. So for me, the more I came to grieve my own childhood and then begin to verbally ventilate and get public about it, and write about it and write poetry and all sorts of things, I began to blossom and come out of myself. I spent many years using alcohol, suppressing my own childhood trauma. I went through sexual abuse from the age of 3 until 15, and I've got no family contact as a result of that. So it's been a lonely life, but I got on with a business for many, many years on my own, running a contract cleaning company, making a lot of money and looking after a lot of people. At one time, I had about 45 staff in total. And I was drinking a bottle of wine a night. And then eventually, when I stopped drinking, I won't use the word, something hit the fan, and I ended up having flashbacks and nightmares. So for many years, I was self-medicating. And that is a way of disassociating. When people are abused as children, they disassociate. So there's a personality split. It's like you're not who you truly are. So you can imagine, if there was a child, one has a child and they abuse that child constantly, day in, day out, that child is not going to blossom and flourish, and their normal emotions are not going to, flow. They're just going to shut down and they're not going to be who they are. So what I'm going to do, if anybody wants to speak to me or comment in the comments box, but I'm going to read a bit of this book. I'm not reading the whole chapter today, but I was thankful that I did have a chat with somebody and they suggested the chapter 8. So here I go. I'm going to read a little bit and I'll look to see if there's any messages as I go. So chapter 8 is fully feeling depends upon fully remembering. So he says here, prior to beginning recovery, most survivors of severely dysfunctional families remember little of what happened to them before the age of 5. Some don't remember anything before 12. The length of the period of childhood amnesia generally correlates with the degree and the extent of early traumatization. This chapter describes the importance of retrieving more accurate information about childhood so that we can thoroughly understand exactly what it is we need to recover from and what actions are required to enable that recovery. Dennis Holey, in Becoming Your Own Parent, identifies some of the key problems that adult children used to recover from. So let me see, close. What? Okay, I'm going to keep reading. He says, equally devastating as a result of this kind of childhood is a personality profile that encompasses horribly low self-esteem, the inability to have fun, being super responsible or super irresponsible, and becoming a dependent personality terrified of abandonment. The tragic consequence of the tens of millions of adult children from unhappy homes is that they don't know who they are, don't know how to take care of their own needs and feel good about themselves, and don't enjoy intimacy. So if you can get that bit there, you can see that from this little bit that I've just read, that you're affected. And I know that I was affected that way. Like, I'd basically just stay away from people. When I went through my years of partying, I used to live in a place called Ladbroke Grove in London. And I went through, when I was running my business in my 30s, I was literally, drinking a bottle of wine every night. I didn't have a day off, and smoking probably about 30, 40 cigarettes a day, which is horrifying. But I stopped both of those as I began to heal, and I stopped the drinking. And then in 2012, and then I stopped smoking cigarettes, more of the emotions came up, and I got very angry that my childhood had affected me that badly, that I was in a situation of just abusing myself. I didn't know how to take care of myself properly. So I'm going to continue reading this. Hi, Catherine. I can see you there. Thank you. I'm going to continue reading from this book. So I didn't finish that little bit. He says, don't know how to take care of your own needs and feel good about themselves, and don't enjoy intimacy. These minions get involved in disastrous relationships, act impulsively, judge themselves without mercy, and constantly seek approval and security. And then I'm going to continue reading this. And if anybody asks a question, I'll pop on, I'll see. Okay, so constructing a detailed picture of childhood abuse and neglect. In our culture, the Judeo-Christian commandment, honor thy father and mother, could be more accurately rendered as Alice Miller's book title, Thou Shalt Not Be Aware. The blind obedience demanded of us by our parents in childhood left many of us ignorant of the effects of the verbal, spiritual, emotional, and physical abuse and neglect we suffered. I suggest that you now review Appendix A. I'm not going to do that, though. He's telling me to go to another part of the book. He says, this appendix outlines the primary forms of abuse and neglect and contrasts them with the verbal, spiritual, emotional, and physical nurturance that dysfunctional parents give to their children. So we can see that belief, which is a religious belief, which is about, it goes back about 2,000 years, honor thy mother and father. So regardless what religion is telling people, I'm not anti-religion, but we've really got to look at how we've been brainwashed and how unhealthy it is for society. That that belief means that when you tell a friend, as I told people as I was growing up that I was going through abuse, that, you know, you have to forgive your parents and you have to honor your mother and father, regardless of what they've done to you. And to be honest with you, that is complete bull. To me, it's the point that if parents honor their children, then naturally children will honor their parents back. And, you know, there's a lot more on that, but people can probably see how that's quite damaging. And also, if people have not been through abuse and you're watching, it's really good to know that if you have a friend who's been through abuse, the best thing you can do is listen to them. And, you know, the word forgiveness is a big trigger for people that have been through sexual abuse, violence, and such like. And verbal abuse can be terrifying for people as, you know, little people. We know that anyway. It makes sense. You know, if I was an adult abusing a child right now, I would hope that somebody would report me or string me up, so to speak. I wouldn't want anybody standing by and watching that happen. I'm going to continue reading. So we have, in our culture, I've read that bit. Have I? In our culture. Right. So then he says, many of us have great difficulty dismantling our denial and minimization about our childhood suffering because the most impactful aspects of it occurred during our amnesic preschool years. Many of us enter recovery with little memory of or sense of how we were actually parented during that time. Most survivors have huge memory gaps before the age of 6. As recovery progresses, many discover that they receive little or no attention from their parents during this time, and that what attention they did receive was often marred by impatience and irritability. Most toddlers in our culture are routinely subjected to intense periods of scolding and spanking. They are hampered in their development by enormous amounts of unnecessary restriction and discipline. Many parents are oblivious to the fact that children need a great deal of permission to explore their immediate environments. It is crucial to their development that they be allowed to participate as much as possible in all that transpires around them. Functional parents liberally and patiently greet their children's eagerness to participate and help, regardless of the fact that this usually makes tasks take longer. Functional parents are also childproof their homes during the toddler stage by moving all dangerous and breakable items out of reach, instead of systematically punishing and extinguishing their children's healthy curiosity and adventurousness. It is an awful state of affairs that so many mothers in our culture routinely arouse sympathy with exasperated complaints. He's into everything. I'm just trying to put on a bit of a voice there. He's into everything, when they should instead be proudly exulting in their children's wonderful sense of exploration. And I think the thing is, so many people are stressed out. I mean, we come from a culture where, when I was born in 1966. So this means that when I was born, there was so little awareness, and it's only that, you know, now that people are a bit more awake. But now we've got, I'm not going to condemn people, but now we all do it. We're all going around looking at our mobile phones. Like, you see people walking around and not dealing with their children. So each generation ends up with some form of complex PTSD. And Pete Walker quite rightly points out, sorry, Catherine, am I ignoring you? No. Seeing you on talk chat there. So 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys go through sexual abuse, violation, verbal abuse and stuff like that. And one is not worse than the other, because children, you know, as children, it doesn't matter whether it's, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but abuse is abuse. So whether it's sexual abuse, it's, you know, physical abuse and punishment, or verbal abuse, it's all the same. So often we can get in groups on Facebook and stuff like that. People say, oh, or if I tell people my story, they say, oh, but my story isn't as bad as yours. The point is, it's all equal. Child abuse is child abuse. It's not like mine wasn't as bad as yours. It just doesn't pan out in reality. A child is a child. So I'm going to continue reading a little bit more. And let's see where I'm at. So he also says that it's an awful state of affairs that so many mothers in our culture routinely arouse sympathy with exasperated complaint ease into everything, when they should instead, I've read that bit, be proudly exulting in their children's wonderful sense of exploration. He says functional parents give their children as much room to investigate as possible, as it supports the growth and intelligence and confidence. Parents who nurture their children in this way, in the terrible twos into the terrific twos. And we hear that, oh, the terrible twos, you know, it's a put down. You can't help it if you're two. You know, you're two, you're going to have to be, if you're born, you're going to reach two at some point. So why not have it be the terrific twos? Their children are not forced to spend excessive amounts of time rightfully tantruming against unfair and harmful restriction and containment. The parents themselves are also rewarded by having their own capacity for finding fascination in the mundane things that their children do. Unfortunately, few parents in our culture are relaxed enough to allow and encourage their toddlers' huge appetite for interaction and exploration. Instead, many parents routinely shame and punish their children's exuberant hunger for mastering their environment. So I'm going to read the last bit of this, and I'm going to say something here. So impatient mothering usually costs children a great deal more than impatient fathering, because children typically spend so much more time with their mothers during the enormously formative preschool years. The lack of memory of these times supports the gross, widespread denial about our mothers' roles in the traumatization of our self-esteem and confidence. Many survivors stimulated, I think it says, to remember these times when they observe other mothers mothering their children, expressiveness in public places like malls and supermarkets. I'd like to make it clear that in this, I am not trying to minimize the traumatic effects of absent fathering. So he's making that clear, because clearly we live in a society that is very difficult. You know, we're not, you know, there's so many things that go on that are not helpful, you know, that mothers have to work, so this isn't about, you know, looking at people and putting people down. This is about the fact that for people who are now suffering C-PTSD and anxiety, social anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, and recovering that part of ourselves. So this is what this book is about. I don't know anybody who's popped on. I'm going to show it to you again. The links are all going to be below. And then also the link where you can contact me if you need to, because I'm on Facebook as well. And do share this out if you know people who've been through this stuff, because so many people also can't afford therapy. I've been lucky enough that in London, we have something called the NHS system. So as you work through life, it means that they collect taxes and it covers everybody. It covers people that don't work. So it's not like in America that you need insurance. Here, everybody gets their fair share of healthcare. And then it means that, for instance, I've been given a 1.5 years of therapy with a clinic through my doctor, which has been really helpful, so I can get to objectify my own abuse, and I've begun to flourish. And if anybody that is struggling with you know, disassociating. So I was disassociating with alcohol. I didn't want to feel my pain. It was too painful. And I was lucky that I got to a point where I did stop, and it was hard to stop because it was, you know, it was a big crutch for me. And the minute I stopped, I started having these out-of-body experiences and nightmares, and it was scary. And for months that went on, I started then to get unwell, couldn't breathe through my nose 3 months after stopping drinking. Because this is what happens when we get fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which I'll explain in a minute. They're called the 4 Fs, which is fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It means that the adrenals and the cortisol gets pumped, and it goes to the adrenals, and the biology of the body means that the immune system gets weakened. But the good news is that as we get healthy and we have less stress in our bodies, then we begin to get healthier. And that's what's happened for me. I'm healthier now in my life than I've ever been. And that's my absolute truth. Eventually, after stopping drinking, it led to a breakdown in 2016. So I lost a business of 29 years because I couldn't function. I went into a flashback regression. I was being goaded by somebody to forgive my parents, and they were telling me that I was not doing my spiritual work properly. This was a friend. I was not doing my spiritual work properly, and I was not following my spiritual work, and that I was not a good person because I would not forgive my parents. And that person, that goading, sent me into a flashback, which gave me I started shaking. And at that point, I got into such a bad moment that I ended up losing 20 pounds in weight over about 3 weeks. And my hair started falling out a few months later, literally, like it was a nightmare. And then I was trying to get paperwork together for my business, and I couldn't get it together. And when that happened, I lost my business, and I had to then really try and recover. It was a really scary time. So that was in 2016, and it's taken me about 1.5 years to recover, but I got my therapy sorted out. In 2017, I got Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And the thing with sexual abuse, or any abuse that we have in childhood, there's so many people walking around. If we go back to that 1 in 3, as Pete Walker says, the records are 1 in 3 girls has sexual abuse, violence, or violation, and 1 in 5 boys. Now, if there's 7.5 billion of us on planet Earth, that's a hell of a lot of people who are going around with trauma inside them. And most of us, like, you probably look at me or meet, if you met me on the street or whatever, you would think there were, when I had my business, nobody would know that wounding is so deep. So it's worth knowing as well, not everybody knows the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. PTSD is when a veteran goes off to war, as an example, and that's one example, and they see a really horrifying event, and they come back and they keep flashing back to that, and it gives them, a lot of symptoms, and it's very tricky. I'm sure it's not just one-off, but an idea. Complex PTSD is a long period of trauma. It's like consistent. Like if you have a child and you tell them every day, you treat them really nastily, and you're nasty to them, and you don't meet their needs, then eventually they're going to go inward, and they're not going to blossom. It's so sad that human beings do this to each other. It's beyond me. So maybe I'll read a little bit more. I'm going to go back to this. So he says I witnessed many survivors having an especially difficult time validating their losses around the non-physical forms of abuse and neglect. Therefore, this chapter presents an in-depth exploration of the nature of verbal, spiritual, and emotional abuse and neglect. At the same time, it is also important to note that many survivors minimize the consequences of the physical abuse they have suffered. You might test yourself for this. Let me see. Thank you, Catherine. I can see your message there. Okay. So he says, you might test yourself for this. Right now, I don't know if you want to do this, you can maybe play back. I don't know if I'm going to do this bit, but I'm just going to tell you this is what the book says. I'm not suggesting you do this right now. Maybe you can listen to it and decide for yourself afterwards. So maybe don't do this right now. Just hear what I'm saying, what he says. He says, you might test yourself right now by closing your eyes and imagining that an enraged person 3 times your size has just entered the room glaring at you. And suddenly she yanks you up by your arm, holding you suspended in the air, smacks you on the buttocks with all her force. Now, if that really happened to you, can you imagine the terror you must have felt? And yet, this is not an unusual scene. So what he's saying is, if somebody came into my room right now and picked me up by the arm and walloped me, I'm going to go into fight flight. It's going to completely freak me out. And then if that parent, or sorry, not parent, if that is actually somebody I know that's doing that, it's really going to shock me. If it's a stranger that's doing it, it's going to shock me more. And that will give us, we'll go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So I will explain that on a video tomorrow. I've got other videos that explain the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, which is the mode we go into to protect ourselves when we've been through abuse, and then it becomes pretty normalized. So for me, I tended to go into flight and dissociate. So I'd get busy, I'd drink wine, smoke cigarettes, to keep my trauma down. And that's the flight mode. And there are many ways we can do it. It's not just alcohol. It can be, busy. There's nothing wrong with using social media. We can use it well, but we can get overly zoned out and busy doing nothing and just to zone out. People do it in different ways. Some people do it with food, So again, foods can be an issue. Overeating maybe, can be a way of not feeling, So there are so many ways that we disassociate. So he says, if that really happened to you, can you imagine the terror you must have felt? And yet this is not an unusual scene. Many parents with an even greater size differential routinely strike toddlers, often repeatedly in this manner. If this does not seem to be necessary to recall every single incident of abuse to achieve significant recovery, on the other hand, it is essential that we identify the key themes of our abuse and our neglect in order to recover. Some examples of these themes are criticism of physical appearance, sarcasm about crying. So I definitely had my physical appearance, picked on as a child by my parents, bizarre as it is. Sarcasm about crying, and people say, you might have heard it, like people say, he says here in this book that, you stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. I mean, what a horrible thing to say to a child that you love, that's yours. I don't know, but there you go. That's what some people do. Some examples of these themes are criticism of physical appearance. Okay. Belittlement about expressing anger. And then he says degradation for making mistakes, humiliation about aspirations and dreams, deprivations of affection, general lack of interest, failure to teach basic survival skills, poor care in matters of grooming and diet, lack of protection from others, and unfair criticism, and so forth. Many of these themes can be summed up as the no self-esteem rule. While many dysfunctional families enforce denial and minimization through the infamous no talk rule, even more operate with the unspoken rule that children are not allowed to have self-esteem. Without a detailed memory or sense of our abuse and neglect history, we remain developmentally arrested in important areas of our needs and rights. Unless we identify and reclaim these needs and rights, we will not mature into fully feeling and fully expressive adult human beings. So then he goes on, he says, let us now look at the many ways in which self-esteem is destroyed by abusive or neglective parenting. So the first one is, I'm not going to read this now. I'm going to probably stop in a moment, but and then be back with more tomorrow, same sort of time. But he says, as an example, I'm just read the titles. He says verbal abuse, emotional abuse, the deadly doer of verbal and emotional abuse, sarcasm and teasing disguised abuse. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to those sort of things. So, and if we have friends that do that to us, I mean, there comes a point where we've got to look at the people around us as well. And, are our friends healthy? Not healthy, but are our friends uplifting us, or are our friends, knocking us? So we've got, and when we've been through abuse, then we make these choices, or we don't, pick people up on their behavior towards us. We've got no way of self-protection. And as we bloom, we begin to then stand up for ourselves. So if somebody does something or says something that's off and is abusive, like if they put us down or about our appearance or stuff like that, then we stand up for ourselves. And that's the development arrest that happens in childhood that we need to reclaim. So we're going to look at some more of this tomorrow. I'm going to sign off, and I hope if anybody's there. If you want to look at the links below or share this out or hit the notification button if you want more of these this week, that would be really great. And I hope it's been valuable to somebody out there to know that healing also is not all or nothing. It's an ongoing process, but we need to understand, we need the psychoeducation to understand what's going on in order to begin to bloom and live our lives fully. Okay? Okay, so that's it. I'm going to sign off now. Thank you, Catherine, for your messages there as well. Thanks for joining me tonight. And I'll be back with more tomorrow. Thank you for joining me. I don't know who else is there, but I really appreciate it for listening. Thank you.